Before the video starts, I just want to say I don't think the Ashita no Joe manga ending was bad. I wanted to make this video to point out how the anime improved the already great ending. I believe an anime's job is to take the source material and improve it with either animation like Demon Slayer or change a lot of parts of the story entirely like Bleach's new season. The anime adaptation of Ashita no Joe surprisingly made a couple changes to the original story, by either adding some new scenes. For example, all the whistling Joe did in the anime isn't part of his character in the manga, or removing things from the story entirely to help with things like pacing. Normally, stuff that is changed usually doesn't affect anything since, for example, the anime and the manga end to the same outcome, but the anime completely outdoes the manga in every way possible for the ending, and here's why. Now in the manga, Joe almost beats Jose Mendoza as Jose almost got knocked down 3 times in one round, but just as the bell rings, he falls, so it's not counted. In the anime, Joe only managed to knock Jose down twice in the final round, and it just ends with a slugfest. Personally, I don't like how the manga approached the ending to this fight, since to me it feels cliche that if there was one more second left, Joe would have won. I much rather prefer the anime's take on this fight, since while yes, Joe did happen to land his 2 strongest punches on Jose, it still wasn't enough to carry him to beat the world's strongest boxer, and it felt much more desperate if he even could knock Jose down again in the last few seconds, versus Jose already falling down in the last few seconds. Afterwards, the anime adapts the manga panel for panel until we reach the most beautiful yet tragic scene in all of fiction, which brings me to... In the manga, after Danpei tells Joe how great he did, it's only a panel of him saying his name before we cut to the end. It kind of sounds like I skipped something, but that's really all it is. The anime chose to add more before we cut to the final scene, which was a lot of characters we have come to know coming to the same realization as Danpei, and Yoko's reaction in particular is equally as important to Danpei's, and the anime chose to capitalize on that. What makes this basically filler scene important is that Joe handed Yoko the gloves he wore for this fight after it ended, which basically was an apology for how much of an asshole he has been to her. This is important because it showed how Joe was finally able to put aside his differences and come to an understanding of her. Yoko had feelings for Joe, and this scene made it ambiguous whether or not Joe also developed feelings for Yoko and was finally able to learn to love. Which makes the scene of Yoko dropping Joe's bloody gloves on the floor as she realizes the condition Joe is in all the more tragic. We then cut to the scene of Joe's burnt out body. It's the same as the manga until in the anime there are some very brief flashbacks of Joe in a junkyard, which makes sense because when Joe was sleeping in his match with Jose, he was hallucinating himself fighting against Rikishi, which is an abstraction from reality. You may think that these scenes interrupt the final zoom in, but I'm happy to think that at least Joe's last thoughts were tranquil ones. Now, personally, some of my favorite scenes in the show are ones that feature an abundance of warm colors with the giant sun in the background, like when Joe eats sandwiches that Noriko made for him in the second opening of season 2. I can't explain why I love the aesthetic so much, but the anime adding these scenes in really isn't needed, but honestly, I think it makes the last scene better. The second opening of season 2 that these clips were taken from perfectly show us who Joe is as a character, and combining it with him finally being satisfied in life proves that everything he did to get to this point was not in vain. Speaking of the second opening of season 2, obviously manga cannot have sound, but when the anime chose to go out with a banger like this one, it was just able to add a new layer of impact to the final shot itself. It adds an even more bittersweet feeling and definitely implies how satisfied Joe is with his life. This was definitely a creative decision made by the director Osamu Dezaki, who definitely preferred for jazz to be the staple genre of music used in this show, and if you want to know more about him, I highly recommend Caribou-kun's video on him. Now between the two scenes, which conveys the final shot better? A sudden cut to Joe being satisfied, which definitely implies how fast and sudden death can be, but doesn't really last for me. Or a slow zoom in, starting from far away to ending with Joe's satisfied face, which takes 1 minute and 50 seconds to do before cutting to the end. I'll let you decide which you prefer, but to me, the anime gives more closure to the story. Like I stated earlier, yes, both series have the same conclusion, but the anime wraps things up much better in my opinion, but that isn't to say that the manga's ending is bad. Obviously, it choosing to go out the way it did has to be among the boldest choices the series could make at that time, and even today. Most of the reasons the anime was able to improve the ending was because of the limitations that a piece of paper can have. The ending of Ashita no Joe is still relevant today, which is obvious by the fact that if you type Ashita no Joe into Google, the second suggested search is Ashita no Joe death, and the amount of times other animes have referenced it. In all reality, I'm grateful that we were able to receive a send-off this perfect in either form. And it makes me happy to think that this scene, being as influential as it is, may make some people check out the series that is being lost to time, and maybe even fall in love with it. So, on that note, this is Mex signing off. It's been real.